Welcome everyone to day 6 of Java lessons. This is crazy. You guys have basically learned uh, all the basics of coding, and now we're going into the core of Java, and the core of basically almost any modern language. And this is where coding becomes actual coding. Uh, and that's why it's so hard. Once you wrap your mind around the concept, though, and figure out how to apply that concept to the syntax, then you should be fine. So let's get into the lesson. So, what is an object? An object is just in coding is just like objects in real life. If So far we have been working with very simple data, integers, strings, characters, but how would you represent real objects using that data? How would you represent an animal or a pencil using just strings and numbers? Well, the answer to that is by creating objects. So objects are simply things with multiple properties and multiple functions. Basically, they're things that can be described or things that can do things. So, as in two examples, pencils, they have properties, they have lengths, they have a length, they have a number, like number one pencil. Nobody uses number one pencils. They have number two pencils, and mostly people use number two pencils. They have a company name, usually pasted on the side of the pencil. And pencils have functions. They can do things. You can write with them. You can erase with them. And animals, again, they're objects as well. They have dimensions, height, width, fur color. They have skin color, scale color. Whether or not they have scales, that's a Boolean value. What color their eyes are, or how long their fur is, or how long their claws are. These are all properties. And they also have names. We call dogs dogs. We call lions lions. Animals also have functions. They can do things. They can make sounds. They can move around. They can climb. They can swim. They can do all these different things. And so, now how do we create these objects? How do we create animals and pencils using code? And the answer to that is classes, the other side of this lesson. So what is a class? A class is just the blueprint for an object. So before we make the object, we make a blueprint. And this blueprint will say what properties the object has and what actions it can do. When we make an object using a class, that object is called an instance of that class. It's one version of that class. And so now how do we do that? How do we make the object how do we make the class say the properties and the actions that the object can do? Well, we give the class variables and functions, the two core things that we have been learning about until this point. And so, classes can have static properties, property and functions, and all that means a static property or function. It's that property or function is used by every single object or every single instance that we've made out of that blueprint or class. And so now you know what static means. It means that we don't have to make an object out of a class before using it. Every member of that class, every object made from that class, can use that a static property or function. Usually we have one class in coding that handles making and using other classes and objects. And we usually don't make an object out of that class. It's like having an animal tamer and their animals. The animal tamer is not an animal, and so we can make the animal tamer can get at other animals and use other animals, but they cannot be an animal themselves. And so you have one class that manages all the other classes, and that's the class we've been using this entire time. So how to use classes? This is where I'm going to get into the code. And we were going to go to our favorite free online IDE and compiler, codiva.io. So let's create a new project. We're going to call it classes. Now this is where we create our first class, and we're going to call it animal tamer. object.java. And usually when people make class names, they capitalize all the letters. So we have our animal tamer class. That's the first step we have to do. Now we're going to create an animal class. And if you've ever seen this plus button while we have been doing tutorials, this is where you can create a new file. Instead of making an animal tamer class, I'm going to create an animal class. Now we have two different files. Now the main function, we only want it in the manager class. We don't want this function to run for every single class we make. Otherwise, it'll run multiple times. So we're going to get rid of this one for the animal class. We only want main to run once, and we want the manager of all the classes to run it, which is the animal tamer in this case. Now we're going to create an animal. This is how you create an object using a class. It's called using the constructor of a class. How do we do that? Objects and classes, an object is just, we make it a variable. We treat it as a variable. And so to create an object, it's almost the exact same process as creating a variable. First we say the data type of the variable. And in this case, it's not a string or an int or a character. This time it has the data type of the class. So because we're creating an animal of the class animal, the data type is going to be animal. We're going to create an animal. And so let's pick an animal. Let's just do lion, right? Same. Okay, so yeah, we're going to create a lion. So our lion, now what do we put inside? There's this very special keyword or very special function called new. When we say new animal, what that does is it goes to the constructor of our animal or our class or our blueprint, and it says, hey, create a new object using this class. And we have to put the parentheses, just like calling a function. It's like calling a function. Now, the function we're calling is the animal's constructor function. We didn't create the constructor function yet, but I will show you how. And now, if you don't create the constructor function, it creates one for you. So, all we're saying here is we're going to create a variable that is an object with the data type or class animal. And we're going to put inside of that data, that variable or that object, a new version of our class, one instance or one object made using the animal class, and we use that by typing the new keyword. And so that new keyword calls on the constructor of our class, and because we're calling a function, it'll have the same exact format as creating a function. So yeah, let's review functions. How do you create functions? Well, usually, you're gonna first have the keywords, right? We're going to have public, right? And because we only want, because when we create a new animal, it'll be specific for each animal and not for every animal, we're not going to use the static keyword. The static keyword, remember, it's when you use it's creating a property or function that every single member of that class can use. Now, because when we create a new animal, that constructor is only called for that one specific animal, we're not going to use the static. And actually, in this case, when you're creating a constructor, again, the constructor is all it is the function that's called when you first make that object. All you need is the name of that class. So, this is how we created a constructor. It doesn't have a return type. It will always be void, so you don't have to include void there. It's not static because it's not used by every single member of that class. It's only used by the object that we were creating. And we don't have to include public because it has to be public. If we're creating an animal, we're not going to keep that private. We're going to keep it public. So all you need is the name of the class to create the constructor. Now, why do you need a constructor? I will show you guys something very cool. You can, I've always shown you creating variables right here, right in this, inside the main function. You have an integer 5, integer name equals Luke, right? Oh, why? My name is not an integer. Okay, but we don't even have to have the variable here. We can actually include it. Oh, I forgot that. Okay, we can actually include it right over here. So all we're saying is now our public tamer has a property string name equals Luke. So we're going to do the exact same thing here. We're going to give our animal properties right above the constructor. Now, we don't have to put any. We're not going to put anything in our constructor yet. I will show you what we're going to put in our constructor. So now we can add functions and properties to the class and figure out how to use the animal tamer class with it. So what properties do animals have? They have a width. Actually, we don't want to make them feel bad. We're gonna have a height for them, right? It'll be in inches. I don't know how tall most animals are. Let's just give it a certain height. And we're also going to give it a certain weight, a height and weight, 100 pounds. Now, we've given our animal heights and weights. It's simple as that. Now, what if we don't want it? What if when we create a new animal, we'd want it to have a different height and a different weight for every animal we create? Right here, I'm saying every single animal and every single animal that I create, whether it's a lion or dog, it'll have the height of 60 inches and 100 pounds. But what if I want that to be different? What if I want the lion to weigh differently from the dog? Well, this is where you know that can be implemented. This is where that can happen. I'm gonna get rid of that because that's unnecessary. So right here, to access that variable, let's make these public variables so that everyone can access them. So now my animal tamer class, which is a different file, can now access these integers. I can say my lion, I want it to actually have a height of 100. Let's say give it 100 inches. It's a really tall lion. How do we do that? Well, there's a special little key. It's the dot key or the period key. Now what this does is it gives you access to the properties or functions of that class or of that object. So we type in the name of our object, lion, and to use its data, right, to use this property or function, we simply type in dot and the name of that property or function. So let's change its height to 100. Bam. Now we can system.out.println that height, lion.height. So you have to remember the dot key because it's super important in this case. So yeah, that's how we access it. Now what if we want to create a function? Let me get rid of this constructor for now. I will show you that later. What if we want to create a function? Let's call it public void. It's not going to return anything. Roar or make sound. Make sound. So this is now our function. It's a make sound function, and these two, the creating a function and creating a variable, are very similar. You can see they have the exact same format, except the function, instead of an equal sign and a value, it has parentheses and curly brackets. Parentheses we put in the inputs, and curly brackets we put in what we want it to do. So what we want our make sound to do is we want it to make a sound, roar, or exclamation mark, right? So how do we use that function now? All we have to do is say lion.makeSound. It's the exact same way it's the exact same way as creating or using its variables or using its properties, using its height. Except this time we have to include those parentheses. That's what tells our program that we're calling a function. We're using a function from that class or from that object. So again, let's go really quickly review this. We created a class, which is the blueprint for our object. It says what properties our animal has, what functions it can do. Now, how do we create that? We create a new variable that will hold an object of class animal, which we said right here. The data type is an animal. By calling a new version, we're creating a new version, a new instance, a new object from that class. And we do that by saying the new word and the constructor, which is just animal and parentheses, the name of the class and parentheses. Now to edit those properties or to see those properties and print them out, we have to type in the name of our object, right? Lion, the one we created, and we say dot height. And when we say dot, it means, hey, use the property of this object. Use the height of this object. And we're going to assign it to 100. Now we can also call a function by saying dot, lion dot. And it'll make a sound. Now let's run this. It printed the lion's height, which we made it 100, and then we printed make sound. We printed the roar when we said for it to make a sound. Alright, so we unpacked a lot. I showed you guys all about classes. Now we're going to learn one little thing before we move on, and this is, again, the constructor. Let me delete this code to clean things up real quick. What if we want to create a variable but don't want to give it a value yet? What if we don't know the value yet? Then all we have to do is not say the equal sign. We just have to say integer, height, and semicolon. That means we're creating a height variable that can hold an integer, but we haven't put anything in it yet. Now what if you try to print out height? There's nothing in it. And it'll error out. And our compiler, or our IDE, or our text editor, all these are the same thing, it doesn't know what to print because there's nothing inside height. Now why would you ever want to do this? Well, it's when you have classes. What if you want, and I will show you how, actually. I will show you now why this is so important. And actually, when you say int height and just semicolon, what's inside height right now? You think it's just an empty box. And how do you represent that empty box? What data is inside that empty box? We call that data null. Null is not zero. It's not nothing. It's actually it is nothing. It's nothing. it's the absence of anything. And so 0 has a value of 0. It's an integer 0. But null has no data type, and it actually is its own data type, null. And you can't create a variable of data type null. It's null, you'll only see it when you create a variable, but don't give it a value yet. And I will show you why this is important. Let's get rid of these values. Now, all we're saying is, hey, our animal will have to have a height and a width. But we don't want to give it a height and a width until we created that animal. Because if we make a lion, we want to give a certain height and width. But if we create a dog, we want to give that a certain height and width. So we don't know what height and width we want it to. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Pretend I didn't say that. Okay, that's a little complicated. So that's when a constructor becomes so important. I will show you now. Again, the constructor, all it is the name of the class. The name of the class parentheses, and curly brackets. It's like calling a function. Now, what do we want? It's exactly the same as calling a function. It's the first function that's called when we create this new object using this class. I'm going to repeat that one more time. The constructor, all it is the first function that is called when we create a new object using this animal class. So, what do we do now? Now, here's this crazy thing. It's called this dot. Wait, I think it is this dot. Yeah, okay. It's this dot. Now, what is this dot? This dot is, all it means is, hey, if we have a certain version of this class, right? If we created a new version of this class, it's called an object, right? Or an instance. What if we want to use one of the heights and variables from that class? Alright, before I show you what this does, I made a little mistake. Now again, I had some weird errors, and I think it's just because I didn't make the class public. Now again, all public means is it can be accessed by every member of every other file in this folder. And so our animal tamer file couldn't create a new object because none of these were public. So again, we're creating a public class. All it means is a class that can be accessed by every file in the folder, so the animal tamer can access it. And we want to make the constructor, because it's a function that's being called, we want to make that public as well. So we have this public constructor. Now, what does this dot mean? Well, if every single animal had a height and weight, right? When we say, if we just said height and weight, how would it know which animal it was talking about? So this dot means if I'm using a certain instance of that class, if I just created a new object using that class, I want it only that object, only that specific animal to have a height of 100 and a weight of 100. Now, why is that important? Because what if we want to declare or say the height and weight of the animal right away? Right when you create that object, I want it to give it a height and a weight. Well, hey, the animal constructor is a function, which means we can give it inputs. We can say int h and int w. Hey, now when we call this constructor, which is just, again, the first function that runs when we create this animal class, it's like the main function. It's the first thing that runs when we create this thing. When we first create it, we have to give it a height and a weight. Now, what it does with that height and weight is for that specific animal that you just created, it assigns that height and it assigns the weight. So now, why is it giving me an error here? It's because we didn't give it inputs. Now let's just give it 100 and 100. Our lion, we want it to have a height of 100 and a weight of 100. Now let's print out its height and weight. Let's just print out its height. It has a height of 100. We did it. So let's see here again. Let me just review that little piece real quick. So when we created our class, our blueprint, all we're saying up here is that, hey, we want it to have a height, we want it to have a weight, but we don't want to give it its height and weight yet. We want it to give it right when we create it. So now, let's jump here. In our main function, again, which is the first function that runs when you run the program, we're going to create an animal that is a lion using our constructor, using the keyword new in our constructor. And when we use the constructor, we want to give it two values. One is the height and one is the weight. Now, because we're calling the constructor, we head over here. It stores 100 in the height and 100 in the weight, and then it gives itself and only that specific object a height and a weight. If you have to pause and rewatch that part again, go ahead, do it as many times as you want. That's why these are YouTube videos, so you can rewatch them later on. Now, that was a lot to unpack, and we're not done yet. we're almost done. Don't worry. This is a long and complicated lesson because classes and objects are complicated, but they are also super important. They are the heart of coding. There's a coding language called Python, and in Python it's super crazy because every single thing you create, every variable is an object, and that's why if you're gonna handle a language like that where every single thing is an object, we have to be able to handle objects at all. And so, whoa, classes, objects. The thing is, we've been dealing with them this entire time, since day one. We have been creating static classes this entire time. Static classes, like the manager class, the animal tamer class, all they are they're classes where you only have one, where all the properties are shared by every member of that class. And all that means is if we only have one of that class, then it keeps its stuff to itself. It keeps its properties and functions to itself. And so there's another case we've been using classes before. If every time I write system.out.println, what does that mean? There's actually a class, right, in the standard Java library. Again, what is a standard Java library? When you downloaded Java, when you downloaded the Java development kit, which allows us to make Java code, the standard Java library is all the functions that it gives you already, that the functions that you don't have to download. Now, lucky for us, because we're using codiva.io, it already downloaded the standard Java library for us. It downloaded the Java development kit, not onto our computer, but online, so we can use it. So again, it's system.out.println. What does that mean? Because we have been using dots, system.out.println looks really familiar now. In the standard Java library, there is a class somewhere that in the library that has a class named system that has a property or a variable called out, which itself is a class. And yes, you can have a class be the property or like a variable of another class. And inside the out class, it has a function called println. And inside that println class, that function, it has an input, which is just a string or integer. And with that string or integer, it prints it out to the console. That's crazy, right? We've been using classes this entire time without knowing it. We haven't been using objects yet, but all an object is to create something using that class. Create a new object. So, now, whoa, we have classes. Does that mean we have to create a new class every time? We have to create a bunch of these classes? No. There are actually classes that other people have made online and they have put online so you can download them for free. Now, we can download classes that other people have made, and we call these libraries. We call it because they give us a bunch of options and a bunch of tools that other people have made. We call these libraries. You can import libraries. That's what it's called. So, now how do you do that? I have an example here. Here's a very important class that we will be using very soon. How do we import a library? Well, all you have to do is type in import, a space, and then the name or the file path of that class. So the one we're going to import is the scanner class. It's stored in Java, inside a folder called Java, right, on your computer somewhere. Util, inside of that Java folder, there's a util folder, and inside that util folder, there's a class called scanner.java, and a semicolon. And what does the scanner class do? It lets us take in input that we could type actively, and it puts it into the console. That's crazy, right? It seems to not make sense. And before we get on to the example problems, I will show you guys how that works. Now let's forget the animal class for now. We're going to create an object that has the scanner data type, right? Just like we did to create an animal. We're going to create a scanner. We're going to call this input. We're just going to call it input equals a new version of that scanner. Now that constructor, what do we have to put in it? All you have to write is system.in. And again, system, which is like system.out.println, is a class stored somewhere on our computer. Now when we write system.in, that gives this input, or this gives this scanner object, right, this scanner class, access to our system's input. So just get used, if you ever want active input, just get used to writing this this line. Now, what does this even mean? How do you even use the scanner? The scanner, or the input object, has functions. And I will show you them now. The main one, right, we're going to be used is string name equals input.next. So, which means when we say input.next, that means in our scanner class somewhere, there's a function called next in parentheses. Excuse me. Now, luckily, we do not need to give it any input. All we have to do is scanner.next. So, what does this whole line mean? Line 6. All we're saying is, hey, we're going to create a string, right? A variable that has a string data type, right? It's called name. And what we want to put inside is the output, right? The returned value of input.next. And so input.next, if you imagine the constructor for that function, it has a value of string, right? So input.next gives us a string. Now we can just print out what we got. Your name is, and then if you remember how to attach, how to stick strings to each other, all you have to do is write the plus function, or the plus symbol. So let's just go over this. We're gonna import, right, somewhere on a computer, or because Codiva is super smart, it has it already. We're gonna import java.util.scanner. It's a scanner class that allows us to get input from the user. And we're gonna say scanner, we're gonna create a new object of the scanner blueprint, of the scanner class. And we're gonna give it, its constructor, access to our system's input, to the keys on our keyboard, using system.in. Now we're gonna create a new variable with the value returned from input.next. And we're gonna print out system, we're gonna system.println, we're going to print out your name is blank, right? Now the cool thing about the input.next thing, the function, is it actually freezes your computer so that you can type something. It freezes the code, the program, while it's running, so you can actually type something. And let me show you how this works. We're going to click run. Now it's waiting. It's actually waiting, and you can actually type something at the very bottom. What is my name? My name is Luke. Now you can press the enter key. Luke. Your name is Luke. It worked just like I said. Now, if you want it to make it a little more clear, before you say input.next, you can say, what is your name? So we know exactly when to type. Let's run this. Wait for it. What is your name? Now we can type something. My name is Bob. Press the enter key. Your name is Bob. So that's how we're going to get input. And this is so crazy, right? That means you can share your code with other people, tell them, hey, just press run, and when they run it, they can answer a bunch of questions, and you can do a bunch of stuff with the data that they answered. So that is why variables are so important. It's so important. We want to store what we've got from the input so we can use it later. Alright. The lesson's almost over. We are finally down to the example problems. Oh, I haven't been doing reviews. I've been doing many reviews along the way, but I will do a review now before we go into this example problem. So, objects. They're just things that have multiple properties or multiple pieces of data inside them and multiple functions. Now, a class is the blueprint for that object. The class says what properties it can have, what functions it can have. How do we create a new object? We say the class name, which is the data type of the object, input, or not input, you say the variable name that you want it to have, the object name, then you say new, and then the constructor name, which is just the class name again. And inside that constructor, inside the parentheses, we can give it any inputs we want. And the reason we would do that is so that we can give it values right when you call it. Right when you create that new object, you can give it a certain value, a certain height, a certain width, a certain weight. Now, the way we access its functions or properties, an object's functions or properties, is we write .net or dot, input dot, the name of our object, which we gave it input, dot, and then the name of the property or the name of the function. And that gives us access to its properties and functions. And that's only if the property or function has public attached to it. Public means that it can be accessed by other members of that folder. It can be accessed by other files, other Java files. Import is how we get classes really easily. We get classes that other people have made that we can use. And you just say import a space and then the name of that class and then a semicolon. A static class or a static property or static variable is just a property or function that can be used by any member of that class. Any object that you make of that class can have that static property. If we don't include static, then each object you make will have a specific value, a different value for that property or function. What else? Usually when you code, you will have a manager class, an animal tamer, and then you'll have certain other classes that you can make objects out of, animals. And the animal tamer will manage and use and create other objects, which are the animals. So yeah, that was my little review, just off the top of my head. If I missed something, you can go back and watch the video, rewatch the video. Otherwise, let's get into the example problems. So I will have one, and then one example problem, and then the next one, which is basically a replica of the first one. Why don't you guys, I will read the example problems, then you can pause, and then we'll start I will do them myself. So we're going to create a student class. Inside that student class, we're going to have two variables, two properties, right? A string that is their name, and an integer that is their grade. Now give that student two functions. One that prints the name, and the other that says the grade percentage and the letter grade. Now, inside a manager class, like a teacher class, create two objects using that class. One will have the name Jim, and the other will have your name. Now give Jim an 86% and yourself a 90%. Now call both the functions on both of those objects. The second example problem is or practice problem. I should be calling them practice problems, shouldn't I? Is to do the exact same thing as above, but instead create only one object, but have that object have the name and grade inputted by the user using scanner. So these are my example problems. If it's not clear, I'm sorry. You will see me do them later, and I will hopefully clear things up. For now, you can go ahead and pause. I will once you unpause, I will be doing these. So let's get into these problems. So let's do the first thing. I'm gonna go ahead, go to my projects. Let's create a new project. Let's call it classroom, right? We're gonna create a teacher class. This will be our manager class. It'll help control. Oh yeah, it defaults to Java. Okay, and I'm gonna create a student class, right? Student.java class. So because this is not going to be the main one, this is not going to be the manager, we're going to get rid of that, and we're going to make this a public class. Now why don't I make public why do I want to make teacher public? It's because because it's the manager, it doesn't need to be accessed by the students. The students need to be accessed by the teacher, right? So let's create again. It's what? Two variables, right? We're gonna give it a variable string name and integer grade. We're not gonna worry about like point whatever percents. And we're gonna give it two functions. Also, we're gonna give it a constructor function, right? So that when we create it, we can give it a name, right? And a name and a grade. String and grade. Oh wait, integer g. This dot, right? This dot name will equal n, and this dot grade will equal g. Remember the this dot. It had this dot, this dot, this dot. Just keep saying it. And we're gonna give it two functions: a public check say name, right? Alright, yeah, forgot. Public void say name. I thought I was missing something. And we're gonna say system, right? Dot out dot print ln. My name is plus this dot name. And when we use this dot name instead of just name, it picks its own specific this certain object's like name out of versus every single object's name. So yes, and the other one has to give it say the percentage, right? Void say grade out dot print ln my grade percentage is plus this dot grade, and then plus the percent sign. Now if you keep coding, right, and you keep learning these different things, you'll find out that there's different ways to do this whole string concatenation thing. There's different ways to make it easier. You can, instead of just like sticking a bunch of strings together, you can figure out how to input variables in, but I don't have enough time to go over that. And I know I spent like 45 minutes going over this, but yeah. If you feel free to look these things up yourself, and if you have questions on them, you don't really understand the documentation, how other people explain it, then go ahead and ask me and I will walk you through it personally. But I want to try to keep these videos as short as possible. So now, we said the grade percentage, but we also want to show them the letter grade. So what do? We have to go back to comparisons and controls. I'm sorry about the crow. So we're going to use the if statement. If you remember what the if statement is it does something if whatever's inside the parentheses is true. You done? Alright. No, I don't have a pet crow. I don't... Okay, so, well, let's check if it's greater than a 90 first, right? If it's greater than a 90, then all you have to say is system.out.println I have an A, right? Now this looks very familiar to what we did last time, and we're just going to implement it again. Else, right? And we can just paste that. Else, right? This is 80. And this is 70. Now if your grade is above an 80 but below a 90, right, you have a B. If it's above a 70 but below an 80, you have a C. Else, otherwise, if it's above a 60 but below a 70, you have a D. And else, sadly, you don't have to put parentheses there because this only executes at the very end, and this only executes if none of the above are true. system.out.println. You have an F. I have an F. I'm sorry. Poor soul. So yeah. Now why didn't I write here greater than 80 and less than 90? Because if it was greater than 90, right? If then it would have already been called here. The system.out.println. It would have already told you an A. So you don't want to try. You want to try to be as. You want to try not to be redundant. That's what I'm trying to say. You want, again, clarity, consistency, concisity, being concise, keeping your short, concise. That's what's important. Being smart about your code. So yes, I don't have to add like the and this dot grade is less than 90 because it already knows it's a less than 90. If it was greater than 90, it would have already printed I have an A. Oh no. Okay. So we made the say name and the say grade function now. What's next? Now we create two objects of this class. Oh. Okay, no. So we're gonna say string, right? We're gonna name one of them Jim, lowercase Jim, because that's the variable name. Not a string. It's not a string. It's a student. Jim will equal new student, right? You're gonna have to get very used to this syntax or these keys, these keywords, right? This format, right? This little format, this constructor format. Let's give it a name, right? Jim, and a grade. Jim has what? He has an 86, all right? Semicolon. Now we're gonna create another student. Me. It's Luke. We're gonna create a new student with the name Luke. And the grade 99. Yes, I have a 99%. Now we're gonna say Jim.say grade, right? Jim.say-name. Oh wait, I did it backwards. It doesn't matter. Luke.say grade. Luke.say-name. So, what do? We created two objects that are both students, and we gave them names and grades as inputs for the constructor. So that when it goes to the constructor, which is the first thing that happens when you create a new object, they can give themselves a name and a grade. They can give themselves a specified. They can give each specific one a non-static grade and name. Now we're gonna do that again, exactly the same with a new object. Now we're gonna call this dot or Jim dot say grade and Jim dot say name, which means we're gonna go into Jim and then use this say grade function, and then go into Jim and use the same name function, and do the exact same thing with Luke. Now let's run this and pray that it works. Yes. So so it goes to Jim first, right? It says his grade. I have a 86, and then he says his I have an 86, right? He has an 86, and that's a B, and then he says his name, Jim. Now it's my turn. I have a 99, and I have an A, and my name's Luke. So it worked. Now we're gonna do the exact same thing, except instead of creating two objects, we're gonna create one, and instead of giving it its values immediately, first we're gonna get these as inputs. So we're gonna create a string name equals. Wait. Before we do that, we're gonna create a scanner. Before we do that, we gotta import the scanner. Let's go up here and import java.util.scanner. We're gonna give ourselves not the parentheses. We're gonna give ourselves access to the scanner class by importing it. So we say scanner input equals new scanner system.in. Now you don't have to call it input. I just like making my variable name or my object name input because it reminds me what this object does. Now we're gonna say string I can't spell string will equal input.next, right? And string or int grade will equal input.nextInt. I didn't really go over this in the lesson, but why is string.nextString just string.next? Well, because we're typing things in, that's already a string. You're already typing in a bunch of characters. So it already knows it's going to be a string. But what if you want it to have a certain integer, or a certain float, or a certain double? Then you just write next int, next float, next double. And if you want to know all the possibilities, you can look it up on the documentation. There's plenty of resources online that tell you what each specific function will do. So instead of giving them a name already, we use the variable name, right? And the variable grade. Because these two we got by having them type it in. So we don't have to name him Jim. We can name him new student. Two things to avoid. You want to avoid naming variables with keywords. Like, you don't want to name your one of your variables new, because then it'll think, oh, I'm creating a new object. You don't want to name it string, because then it'll think, oh, it's a string, or int. You want to try to avoid that. So I'm going to name him new student instead of new. So instead of saying Jim.sayGrade and Jim.sayName, actually I'm going to swap this order. I don't like it. I'm going to say, just going to get rid of that. New student.sayName, and then new student.sayGrade. So again, it'll ask me for two inputs, right? Name and grade, and then it'll create a student using those two values that I inputted, and then say the name and grade. So let's run this. Okay, it's ready to ask for my name and grade. My name is Luke, and my grade is 50. My name is Luke. My grade percentage is 50%. I have an F. It worked. So yes, nothing here we assigned already. Nothing. We didn't say he had an 86. We didn't say his name was Luke. We let that up to the user, right? To me, the typer, so that we can run this and have new values every single time. Let's name this guy Jeff instead and give him a grade of 100, right? His name is Jeff. He has a grade percentage of 100% and he has an A, right? So this works for every new time that you run the program, and you can input different values. That's what we want to make our program. We want to make it dynamic. Dynamic means it can change, right? We want it to be able to be changed easily, so we want to make it as dynamic as possible. So that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.